What is the impact of wireless radiation on cognition and behavior? You're listening to the 2025 EMF HAZARDS Summit. My name is Nick Pinault, the EMF guy, and this is the EMF HAZARDS Summit, Protect Your Children. Welcome. In this presentation, we will review the shocking scientific literature linking wireless radiation from cell phones, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth gadgets, and many others to a decline in cognition and an increase in behavioral problems in children such as ADD, ADHD. Bonnie Tucker is a public health researcher working for the nonprofit organization GSI Research and Training Institute. She has been conducting research for over 25 years. I'm here today with Bonnie Tucker, who's a public health researcher. How are you, Bonnie?
Very good, thanks. It's good to be here.
Well, I was very, very interested when you reached out to me and told me about your expertise, because this is exactly what some people are looking for. You know, some parents are hesitant about what they hear about EMFs. Is it safe? Is it not safe? What can the scientific data, or what does it say about the safety of Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or cell phones? And when you told me you had 25 years of experience as a public health researcher and showed me the presentations you did, I said, well, this is exactly what we need in EMF hazards. So I'll let you run with it. I know you have a presentation for us today, and I'm very excited to learn myself what your findings are.
Okay, very happy to do that. So this presentation focuses on the impact of EMF, specifically RF, so cell phones, base stations, towers, etc. And the focus is on children. And I'll spend a little time in a minute talking about why it's so important to look at the impacts on children. So just to start, and many of you, I think, just intuitively probably appreciate this, but this is a very impactful view of how our environment has changed over a very short period of time. So really over 2 decades, we have gone from essentially no cell phone, no mobile phone activity to essentially everyone in the world having some type of cellular device. And you can see these are subscriptions of cellular accounts per 100 people. So you can see over 2 decades, you know, when you get up into 134, that's more than one per person. And you can see here again, 97% of adults, 96% of children, and these are cell phones. And then of course there are tablets that children are using to support their learning and for entertainment. And then there were some studies that were done during COVID specifically, where children were learning from home using cellular technology, and they were on for more than 4 hours a day. So this is a significant amount of exposure that these children are getting. And this just is a little picture of just kind of a typical inside environment where we have all kinds of different EMF exposures from a radio frequency standpoint. So you've got the router, you've got the laptop, you've got the cell phone, you know, there's smart things happening in this house involving RF. So it's really a lot that's happening within the home environment, school environment, and then also you can see in the background the cell tower. So the exposures are coming from many directions and are kind of built up over many different devices being on at the same time. It's interesting when you look at the literature on the impact of EMF on health. People have been doing this research for over 20 years. And there are many different topics that people have explored, including cancer, male fertility, reproductive outcomes, cognition generally, tinnitus, migraines, and many, many nonspecific symptoms. What's interesting, though, is looking at the lens of the children, and this is why it's so important that we focus on the children. It's because their nervous systems are still developing. Also, the tissues in their head absorbs more EMF radiation due to their thinner skulls. And also, if they are getting exposed at a young age, that means they're going to be exposed over their whole life. So it's a long period of time of exposure. And this is what really got me interested in examining the impacts of EMF on children from the existing literature. And what I found, and I'll be going into in more detail, is the impacts on their cognition, on different behavioral issues, and also just general symptoms, nonspecific symptoms that have been observed in children who have been exposed to EMF. So I'm going to spend some time going through just some highlights of what I found in this research study. So I looked at many studies throughout the world with this, 50 studies. You can see they were done in many, many parts of the world. 12 of these were specifically focused on cognition impacts and 38 on behavioral and health impacts. So it's been done in many places. And just focusing on cognition, from those studies, 10 out of 11 studies showed a statistically significant association between exposure of EMF and cognitive decline. So I want to just take a moment to say that these are associations. And so we are always wondering if there's causation. So we can't always be confident that when we see associations, even when they're statistically significant, that there is actually causation. However, there are different things we can look to help us get a sense for causation. One of them is longitudinal studies, and that's why I kind of have longitudinal and cross-sectional. Longitudinal means they got exposed at one period of time, and then you look later to see if you see impacts. And that can give you a sense that there could be a link, a causal link. Cross-sectional studies are just looking at one point in time. Were they exposed? By how much? And do we see impacts versus those that are not exposed? And when I say exposed, I do want to mention that in these studies, exposed was measured in many, many different ways. Some studies looked at self-reporting exposure, cell phone use. Some studies went as far as putting monitors on children and actually monitoring the level of exposure that they were experiencing. Some studies looked at distances from schools to cell towers. So there were a lot of different ways that studies measured EMF exposure. But many of these were, especially that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about one of them in a minute, where the kids were actually wearing devices that were measuring their exposure. And also one other point about these study designs, of course, these studies were all done after cell phones were out and after cell phone towers were up. So there's going to be no group that had no exposure. It's just really, most of these studies are higher versus lower comparisons. So this was a very interesting study that I wanted to highlight because, and this is one where they actually put the monitors on the kids. And the reason why I think this is so interesting is it kind of helps us also see if there's a causal link. So in this case, they were measuring the extent of exposure these children were getting. They put them in high versus low groups. They also asked and determined if they had a preference for right hand versus left hand use. And if they had, for instance, right hand use, did they use their cell phone up to their right ear? And this study was done kind of before people were starting to move towards more earbuds. So this was a study where people really were using, the children were putting the cell phones up to the ear. And what was interesting was when the authors that did this study looked at the type of cognition that was diminished. It was diminished on the side of the brain that's the right side for the right preference children. So this really gives you a sense that, yes, there probably could be some, we don't know, but some hints that this could be causal. Versus they really didn't see much decline on the left side for the right hand users in terms of language, reading, writing. They saw more figural on the right side. And this is a summary of the more broad, beyond cognition, behavioral and health impacts. These were 38 studies, 34 of them showed a statistical significance where there was an association between higher exposure of EMF and symptomology. And this just shows you not the height of the bar is how many studies were done for that particular type of health impact to give you a sense for how often these things were found. And the breadth of it also gives you a feel for how many different kinds of impacts have been observed. So we can see sleeping problems, headache, hyperactivity, inattention issues, total behavioral issues. These are impacts that have been found over many, many studies. Sleeping problems, 10 studies. Headache, 10 studies. So this also gives us some confidence that this could be a real thing and a real impact. You probably see these odds ratios over here, and I put them here because these odds ratios, and I'll talk a little bit about what it means. The odds ratios are high, and I showed the ranges of odds ratios that were seen in some of these different areas where studies frequently saw these problems. So for instance, sleep problems, odd ratio 1.9 to 5.9. So 1.9 would mean it's a 1.9 greater chance, or almost 2 times greater chance, that the people who were exposed had the impact versus the people who were not exposed had the impact, or lower exposure had the impact. So, or 90% higher is another way of thinking about it. So these are very high odds ratios, which gives us pause and potential concern about the connection between EMF and these issues. And it's really interesting when you look at these different symptoms that were observed to be an issue. You know, a lot of times people attribute these to other things. So like when kids were, at home during COVID, and you may have read articles about kids experiencing these very issues. And here they are, right? So was it that they were isolated? I mean, it could be a whole number of things, but was it that they were isolated and not really being able to engage the way they should in a healthy environment? Or was it the EMF? Was it the screen time, or was it the actual radiation? We don't know, but oftentimes it's not attributed to EMF, it's attributed to these other things. So I think this is a really important finding. Another one that I want to talk about, which also hints at causality, is there were a number of the longitudinal studies that I talked about previously. In this case, there were 13 of them, where they measured EMF exposure at the time that women were pregnant. And then they measured impact of the children when they entered school at 5 years. So this is not screen time. This is not social isolation. This is looking at high versus low exposure during pregnancy and the impact that had on children when they entered school. And you can see 13 of them showed statistical significant association with sleeping problems, headache, hyperactivity, inattention, total behavioral difficulty, and conduct problems. So the kids whose mothers had higher exposure had these issues more so than the kids whose mothers had lower exposure. So these are the very powerful studies and also give us a hint on causality. So this is really a summary of what we found. I'm often asked, well, what should we do? We're surrounded by it. Kids are, learning with these devices. They're engaging with their friends with these devices. They're part of life. And we don't have complete confirmation that it's causal. So this is what I'm going to just share. This is what I usually tell people. Turn off everything at night. To me, this is an easy thing to do. So overall, for children, pregnant women, birthing people, and women trying to get pregnant, and also for children, it probably isn't going to kill them. Well, that's a strong word, but it's probably not going to be terrible on their life if you just turn things off at night. And also often, and I'm sure you've talked about this, Nick, just the ability of the body to be able to heal during sleep, to have these things off at that particular time of the day can be very important. You can also download videos and download music, and then turn off the cellular aspect or the Wi-Fi. Spend your time watching or listening when you're not getting that exposure. Really think hard about the pros and cons of a smart house. How much do you really need all those fancy apps that kind of tell you things that, how much help really is that versus the exposure and the risk you're putting on yourself and your family? Keep phones on airplane mode or off as often as possible, plugging into Ethernet when you're working on your computer. Texting and speakerphone is better, although not ideal. And then interestingly, and this is a big one, I think it's a hard one, but hardwiring schools with Ethernet as opposed to using Wi-Fi. Interestingly, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but in New Hampshire, there was a 5G commission created. Where they actually, one of their recommendations was to work on, it was going to take a while, it's actually not going to be cheap, but to actually take all the Wi-Fi out of the schools and hardwire them. And of course, I'm sure you've also talked about the situations where cell phone towers have been put right near schools or on school property even. That also is very problematic. So that is what I wanted to share today.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to turn off the presentation here and actually have a few follow-up comments. I know that another speaker, Zen Honeycutt from Moms Across America, I just wanted to mention her talk because she talks about action steps as an activist to try to get, let's say, Wi-Fi lowered in school. I won't say, Wi-Fi eliminated because that's a stretch for certain people. However, what she realized, and it was new information to me, I was very surprised by it, is that in many situations, the IT companies who install Wi-Fi in schools will install one access point per classroom, but the real need for a school in many situations is a handful of access points for the entire establishment. So in other words, the administration is not aware that they are overpaying for something that overexposes children. So it is also they have a financial incentive to get fewer access points or a lot of them uninstalled and use, therefore reducing the radiation for kids. So when there's a financial incentive, things move a little bit quicker. I want to also highlight, I know you're probably very familiar with it, but the studies about prenatal exposures, I know that one researcher that was especially impactful for me was Dr. Hugh Taylor from Yale. He's one of the research teams who published a lot of studies, especially in the mid 2010s, or I think 2010, 2012. So I can link to some of them. And many organizations launched something called the Baby Safe Project. That's a good page to look at. But I wanted to ask you about specifically where people can find more about your work. Do you have a website or a blog where you publish information?
I don't, actually, but I'm certainly happy to share. I have my slide deck I'm happy to share. And also, this is all summarized in a thesis that I'm happy to share. It's quite long, but those are things. And then there are some very important systematic reviews that have been done where some of those have been commissioned by the World Health Organization. World Health Organization commissioned 10 systematic reviews in, I want to say like 2022, and they were on a whole variety of topics. One of them was on the birth impacts, so not quite, children, but in utero, likely effects of offspring having health impacts at birth. So they found that through a systematic review commissioned by the World Health Organization, as well as neurobehavioral function impacts on people. And these, this is interesting because the WHO, has this group that's investigating this, and this is why they commissioned these 10 studies. And these are very scientifically done, very carefully done with the full literature. There's papers on each one of the topics that were just on the method that they used for their systematic review, and then the results. And then finally, there's an article, and I can share these as well if it would make it easier for people. There's another article that was done. It was a systematic review, not commissioned by World Health Organization, but some authors did it, where they saw a significant association between EMF exposure and spontaneous abortion. So people lost more babies.
And do you remember, is that for radio frequency exposure, such as cell phones, or is it from power lines, such as the work by Kun Lee, that researcher who talked about AC magnetic fields, the ELF range?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was RF.
Okay.
But I'll provide the study.
Yeah, please do. So I think that in my mind, and that's something I heard from a lot of public health researchers, pregnancy is probably the number one time where you want to be the most careful possible and lower your exposure as much as possible, right? Because of the potential impact that seem to last or could last a lifetime if you are exposed before being born, right? Correct?
Right. Yes, correct. Exactly. Oh, and then don't let me forget, what I didn't put on there is like smart baby monitors, smart bassinets, smart cribs.
Yeah, it doesn't stop, right? Yeah. So try to avoid those. I know, I have to admit, I used the baby monitor a few times when my son was, in that age where you want to monitor and you don't know where they're crying and maybe they're far away from where you're having dinner. But for me, the idea that a baby monitor needs to be next to the face of the baby is completely wrong, right? It needs to be
Right.
as far away as possible while still picking up the signal. And for me, I realize in most situations, 10 to 15 feet from the child was still, they're very sensitive. So it does, minimize the risk if you put it further away.
Yes.
So the idea of distance there is very important. Well, Bonnie, thank you so much for this presentation. I loved it. It's very concise, and at the same time, it gives a good idea of the portrait here. To me, it's clear that there are risks associated with the technology, and whether the science is, clear or unclear, I think we are in this space where being cautious about all these exposures is really the way to go. So they just reinforced the idea for me that I did the right thing as a parent to minimize the radiation that I let my children expose themselves to. I'm glad I did, and I hope that people listening to this will take action and be cautious also. Thank you so much.
Yes, yes. And if I could just say one more thing that just prompted a thought, which is, there's a what's called the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle says, if you don't know for sure that an exposure is causal, that's truly causal to having the health impact. However, the health impact itself can be substantial. In that case, where you're not sure, but the impact can be substantial, you need to take precautions. And that was the conclusion of my study, was that I had hints of causality. I had strong associations from my review of the literature. And so in that case, given the impacts that can be severe and truly significantly impactful to children and their families, you really should endeavor to take the precautionary principle, which is take precautions.
This is great. And I'd add another thing that is against the idea that we should wait for definitive proof of harm to take action, is that in the past, we've gotten it wrong with many toxicants in the environment, that we used to say, oh, we think they are fairly safe. And then 10 years later, we think they probably are unsafe. And then 10 years later, they are definitely dangerous. But it's too late because, of course, you didn't tell people to start taking precaution as the science evolves. So right now, I'm seeing the science evolve in a direction that just shows more and more risks and more harm. And eventually, it will be too strong to ignore. But if you take action today, the worst thing that can happen is you did it for nothing and you avoided a bit of screen time. The best thing that can happen is you really prevented a lot of different health risks for your children. So I don't think, there's any harm of like turning off Wi-Fi at night or minimizing screen time. We already know these technologies should be used in moderation. So this is a great reminder that we should all aim to do our best, minimize exposure right now. After listening to this, you can start taking additional action steps. And of course, as part of this online summit, we're going to have all sorts of action steps and demonstrations that can help you do so. So, Bonnie, thank you for your presence again. This is brilliant, and I'll be in touch to get your slides and the studies you mentioned, so that way we're going to put them right underneath the video. So I hope that everyone got a lot of value from this, and thanks again for your presence today.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
I really hope that you liked this presentation. If you want to take action on what you just heard, you'll find links to everything that was mentioned by our guest speaker right underneath this interview. If you love the summit and want to own the recordings in audio, video, and written form for all of these 2025 interviews, make sure to click the buttons on this page to get the 2025 EMF pack. This EMF pack is heavily discounted during the summit launch and for a very limited time. Remember that every purchase supports my work as an independent citizen journalist, as well as the nonprofit partners that are associated with this summit. Thank you for your attention and support, and I'll see you in the next presentation.